Obviously, electric vehicles have made a huge impact on the auto industry over the past few years. One aspect I hadn't spent much time thinking about is the use of EVs in commercial fleets, like service vans for contractors and large facilities. So I turned to Jay Hudson, Fleet Sales Director for Blink Charging, to share his insights into this side of the EV world. Jay is a fleet management expert with over 13 years of experience. For the last 4 years, Jay has focused exclusively on accelerating electric vehicle transitions by designing and executing complex plans to deploy turnkey charging infrastructure while minimizing any loss to operational efficiency and profitability. He is proud to lead the knowledgeable team of Blink Charging sales and solutions consultants dedicated to helping enterprise clients with large vehicle fleets and diverse real estate portfolios to meet their immediate and future electrification goals. Welcome to Keeping the Lights On. I'm your host, Todd Reed, and on this podcast, I connect with the owners and pros who design, build, and maintain our electrical, communications, and industrial world to explore the best ways forward. So, as you know, Jay, we start out each episode with the meals that bring us together. So, Jay,
Yes.
if I or any of the listeners were to visit you in your hometown, where might you take us, and why would you choose this place?
My hometown's Austin, Texas, and I would 100% take you to a place called Salt Lick Barbecue. It's kind of a staple here in the Austin area. It's been around for 40 odd years. It's the best barbecue experience that you're likely to have when you come here to Texas. So I'd say that taking folks to Salt Lick is something that I do for all friends and family that come into town.
Yeah, sounds great. So what's your favorite meal to get there? And do you typically get the same thing every time you go?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm a big fan of brisket and turkey. So I'll do some ribs here and there. Their beef ribs are exceptional. But I would say like their steady Eddie go-to items are your brisket and your turkey at Salt Lick with Salt Lick sauce. That's sometimes people know about Salt Lick before they've been there because they do have a line of sauces, kind of like Stubbs, which is also here in Austin. Like you've heard of the barbecue sauce before you've heard of the barbecue joint. So, but you got to do it with, in my opinion, the spicy Salt Lick barbecue sauce.
So a couple of things stand out about Salt Lick. One, I was doing a little research, and it was actually brought up by a previous Austin guest. Which tells me I need to prioritize a visit to Austin and to Salt Lick. And I think there's probably 3 or 4 other places I could go. But so that sound, I mean, and the pictures, when I looked last time and I looked this time, the pictures there, they have that grill. It's huge in the middle and it's dripping all the
open pit. You can kind of walk up, take pictures. You don't really get to see that at most barbecue places. It's usually behind the scenes, or sometimes it's even done off site and they bring the barbecue from like one central kitchen to different locations. So it's kind of the authentic experience when you go to Salt Lick, which is pretty fun.
Yeah, it looks amazing. So the second thing I noticed is that they're having a celestial barbecue party on April 8th, 2024. So I don't know when people are listening to this, but this is when we're recording. So I couldn't help but start thinking about our topic of electrical vehicles, EVs, solar, and other generation methods. And so, in addition to multiple generation methods, there are different ways to EV, right? We're all familiar with personal family cars. Over-the-road trucking is starting to catch some steam. Boating and even aircraft are starting to experiment with that. So, but one area I really hadn't spent much time thinking about was EVs in commercial fleets. Jay, can you share a bit on the current state of EV adoption in commercial fleets?
Yeah, well, EV adoption in commercial fleets, particularly in North America, is substantially far behind any counterpart fleets in the European marketplace, mostly because of EV infrastructure. So where I work at Blink Charging, we're a manufacturer and network operator for EV SE equipment. And right now, the prevailing wisdom is, or has been, quite frankly, for the last 30 years in the fleet industry, is that if it doesn't make sense for your TCO or your total cost of ownership, you don't do it. But now we're at a point in the marketplace where companies, particularly operators of fleets at companies, are getting downward pressure from corporate executives, from environmental groups, from interest groups, from consumers saying, hey, if we're going to be a customer of your company, we need to see that you're making efforts to help the environment, decarbonize, call it what you want to call it. And so with with commercial fleets, with the exception of companies that are really at the forefront of the environmental, and sustainability push within the commercial space, everyone's lagging behind, even if they are well intentioned, just because of a lack of infrastructure or a lack of battery technology that can sustain the types of vehicles that they need to operate their fleets at peak capacity or at optimum, like what we call fleet optimization. And so it's we're behind in many ways,
Right.
and that's really where companies like Blink are trying to help folks catch up.
Your typical fleet manager, what are some of the risks that are in the front of their mind besides that you mentioned as they consider a move from, and I think you might have taught me this term, ICE to EV, so internal combustion engine to EV, so ICE to EV.
Yeah, so this is kind of the bread and butter of what I talk about with our customers every day. Is there's three major considerations that are kind of universal for fleet operators and managers. Number one is your financial risk. Two is your operational risk. And I actually like to add a third in there, just because I've been doing this for a number of years now with EV transitions, is your cultural risk. So financial risk is pretty straightforward. You're going to go from gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles. The prevailing wisdom in the marketplace today is EVs are substantially more expensive than their gas-powered counterparts. Now, that has shifted over the last few years. And I don't expect every fleet manager out there to be an expert about that. But there are certainly circumstances where certain vehicles just make more sense to be gas vehicles at this point in time. So it's really about understanding where you're at and where you're trying to get to, so that you could create a plan and a financial picture that helps support whatever financial limitations or restrictions that you have inside of a business. On their operational side, can the vehicle get from point A to point B, carrying either people, goods, or providing services without the anxiety that can come from either range anxiety or charging anxiety, meaning like at point of charging anxiety. So those are two, although they're very closely connected, those are two separate things. And those are things that fleet managers have to work through in order to, one, confidently transition a particular vehicle or set of vehicles to EVs without being concerned that they can't get the person, good, or service to the location that needs to be on to be profitable, to fulfill a service contract, so on and so forth. And then the last one is the cultural shift. A lot of employees are afraid to get into an EV today because they know how a gas vehicle works. They know what their day-to-day work life is going to be like in the gas-powered vehicle. They know that at the end of their route or their shift, if they needed to top up on gas, they're going to get home to their kid to go to baseball practice on time. Versus EVs, there's a fear factor, some concerns there. So a lot of the cultural adoption isn't actually like the senior leaders of a business. It usually has to do with the drivers, the people that are actually behind the wheel. So those are all kind of the considerations that we as experts in the industry have to work with our clients on breaking down those barriers and addressing those concerns when and where it makes sense to do it.
Okay. Are there some other roadblocks as far as like starting the process, like planning for how many vehicles I need, how many charging stations I need, and all that? Is there some concerns there on the fleet manager's part?
Yeah, I would say number one is lack of expertise. Most fleet managers will point blank tell you that they aren't experts when it comes to EV, what I like to call EV ecosystems, right? Acquire the vehicle from the manufacturer, kind of the bread and butter of a fleet manager's traditional role, responsibility, evaluate two vehicles, what has a better total cost of ownership. Pretty straightforward even for EVs. But then you start moving towards having to figure out how to deploy that EV at scale and to continually support that EV once it's in the field. And that could be a pretty scary proposition for a lot of fleet managers. So that's where a lot of hand holding and over communication, and not just like, hey, what's going on in the industry, but like, what are our customers in the industry that have already gone through this? What are they experiencing? And how can we help address some of those concerns up front for different fleet managers and operators in the field?
Okay. And what about when it actually comes to, if they're, which I assume many do, they start to put in their own charging stations? What are some things that can happen like during that construction process that kind of throws them a curveball, or that they're worried about? Like, I don't know.
Number one is, have you talked to your utility lately? How much
Hmm.
power can you draw for a particular site, and what does that mean for not just your EVs, but also the impact that that has on your total metered energy for any particular location? So keeping the lights on and powering EVs have to be, those aren't mutually exclusive propositions for any business. So you got to figure
Right.
that piece out. Expertise. It starts with the vision, like what are you trying to accomplish? And then you're typically going to go into a phase where you're gathering quotes and getting the information that you need from folks like us or others that, know this stuff. Then it comes down to making decisions, but decisions that you make can also be influenced by information that you find out later on, like how much is it going to cost to put in a 50-foot trench in order to be able to support EV pedestals in the location that you currently park those vehicles? Does it require a reassessment of that site as to where things get parked or how things are set up operationally? So these are all things that most fleet managers have never had to consider before. So that's where working with partners like Blink, like Graybar, is going to help them to feel more confident in the decisions that they're making. So then you get your first site in, and everyone, cuts a ribbon, and it's all super exciting, right? But then the problem is for large organizations like yours or like mine, when you start to uh, scale up those projects and you go from
Mm.
one site to two sites to three sites, does the game plan change on a site by site basis? Does it not change? And so that's kind of like another area where we're helping clients. And I just think just take us out of it, like the industry in general is doing a much better job at trying to help folks see that there are different ways of doing business and different ways to reach that ultimate goal, which is productivity of the vehicles that you put in the field.
Okay.
But it might not be exactly like you've done before. But that's not a bad thing. You just got to work through each of the options.
Right. Okay, so you've started to touch on this, the word scalability. So, I think about me putting in, if I buy an EV, I need to put one in my house, a charging unit.
Mm-hmm.
That's could be complicated, but it's fairly easy because it's one. But a fleet manager, man, they start to get multiple vehicles. Then you say they might decide to grow that fleet at some point. So you have multiple charging points. So can you maybe spend a little bit more time on the challenges a fleet manager might face in regards to scalability?
Yeah, yeah. Geography, of course, is going to play a role. You're right to bring up at-home charging. For fleets that vehicles go home at night, there's two things that really have to happen. Number one, you have to choose a vehicle that is going to meet the requirements of that duty cycle for a vehicle. And most vehicles that tend to go home tend to be light duty vehicles, whether they're pickup trucks or sedans, things like that. So most batteries today, not 5 years ago, but today, are capable of anywhere from, let's call it 180 to 250 miles of range, unless we're talking about Rivians where you push up into the 300s, things like that. Generally more than enough for any duty cycle on a day-to-day basis, or just think of the sheer number of hours that somebody can even spend behind the wheel. And so selecting that vehicle is actually, before you even think about the equipment, is super important. Next thing is there's at-home charging, depot charging, and then public charging, or what I like to call charging in the wild. And all three of those systems kind of have to talk to each other, right? A fleet manager needs to be able to assess what's charging at someone's house, how are they getting reimbursed for it, which is another hot button item across the fleet management discussion, is like you're drawing power from a person's house.
Mm.
Like it's like reimbursing them for a cell phone or internet bill. We just got to figure, but the problem is not problem, but the challenge is at this moment is that unlike say reimbursing somebody for driving a gas vehicle, there aren't any federal rules like there are for that type of vehicle for EVs.
Mm.
However, there are rules in European countries where Blink is operating, so we can provide best practice and options. But right now, it's like helping fleet managers figure out not just how to put the right charger in someone's house that minimizes liability, addresses privacy concerns, but also how do you reimburse them for that electricity? Depot charging is pretty straightforward, but the challenge with depot charging is it's pretty expensive to install for the very first time. So what options can partners like Blink provide the marketplace? Is it ownership model? Is it hybrid ownership model? Is it a public access where instead of everything behind the fence, we move the fence a little bit further back, and then we invite people to use those charging stations to offset some of those costs. So these are all different strategies that most companies have never had to think about before, that we're trying to assist them with doing this, because we're effectively building fueling stations in all the places where they garage vehicles, not to mention giving them access to charging in the wild, either on our network or on roaming networks, that kind of is a supplement to whatever they do at the depot or at home. So yeah, lots of optionality, and we're just trying to create what I like to call an ecosystem, like I mentioned earlier, that can help make it really clear and easy for a fleet manager to understand how we can get maximum vehicle efficiency based on the availability of charging infrastructure.
So that's interesting. You yeah. So am I hearing you correctly? So if I owned a fleet, or manage a fleet, and we have charging stations for our fleets on the one side of our fence. Some of them might be on another side of a fence, and I could actually charge the public to use those and kind of offset that cost. Is that what I was hearing you saying?
Exactly. Yeah, it's possible.
Wow,
and not every company wants to do that.
Sure.
But more companies than not are starting to look at the different options that are available to them. Because if there's a way to monetize that use of electricity by the general public, or maybe even an employee, right? Like maybe you set up in the Blink network that your fleet vehicles charge for free. Your employees are charged one rate because you want to give them maybe a preferred rate for them to charge their own EVs. And then the general public, Joe Public, sees that there's a station here, and you can have that completely shut off to the public, or you can have it set up so that they can engage in a charging session, but then you can determine as a business owner or business manager what rates you're going to charge above your cost of electricity. Therefore, there's a method for offsetting that initial investment into your infrastructure.
A couple questions going on. One, I think the whole, that's why I like doing this show. I'd never even considered the thought of like me bringing it, because a lot of people take their cars home, their fleet cars, and I want my company to pay for that electricity I'm using. I don't know that's pretty awesome. So that's another hurdle to overcome. So
it's not something right now. I would say we're at the infancy stage of companies like ours and others figuring out how to do this. And it kind of comes down to the fact that we're in a pre-regulatory environment. There's lots of rules and restrictions on how people are reimbursed for business mileage when they drive for work. How people are reimbursed for the meals, that they expenses that they incur as part of business, but nothing like that exists yet for EVs. So we're using a lot of what we've learned from our friends and partners at Blink in Europe, where Europe is 10 years ahead of the US market in terms of EV penetration, in terms of just sheer volume of EVs, and then EVs being utilized for business purposes. Primarily because the vehicles in Europe tend to be a lot smaller than they are here in the US. But that said, we have those systems in place today, and we're adapting those to the US market as quickly as commercial fleets will allow us to do it.
You mentioned earlier, you used the word infancy, and that makes me think about kind of the technology. It's advancing pretty quickly, relatively speaking. And I'm curious, do fleet managers worry about, I'm going to install this system and it's going to be out of date in a couple of years, and I have to do it all over again, and I don't really want to do that. Is that a concern? Or
I think so, and I think that also requires some education on the part of the marketplace. Let me ask you a question, Todd. What do you think the average life cycle is of an EV level 2 charging station, or what should it be?
The life cycle. So how long you can use one? I buy one net today, and how long should it last? I don't know, 5 years.
You're actually pretty close. 4 or 5 years, somewhere in that range,
okay.
Which is good. The problem is a lot of folks, when they look at EV charging stations, like they'll say, I get this all the time. Someone will tell me when I'm on a business commercial fleet call, they'll say, hey, I pulled up to a Blink charging station and the station wasn't working. Blink's been around since 2009. There's what we call Gen 1 stations that are still in the ground because people
Mm.
bought that equipment and have decided that they either don't want to, replace it for whatever reason, and that could be at a shopping center. It could be at a multifamily housing complex. So, they bought their equipment just like somebody buys an Apple iPhone, and then what you do with it from then on out is kind of on you. But because it's got Blink's name on it and it's visible to the general public, there's this perception out there that, oh, your stations don't work. Well, every 4 or 5 years, we go through this technological update. And the easiest example of this, for me is 3G cell phone networks don't exist anymore. It's only 4G or better. At this point, there were stations built a decade ago that only have the capability of doing 3G signals. Therefore, you got to update your equipment in order to stay relevant, the same way that cell phone carriers have to update their equipment on an ongoing basis to serve their customers. So, that said, those are the kind of like the things that are going on in the marketplace where we're trying to help educate while at the same time continually update the infrastructure. And this is something with fleets I'm very, very sensitive to, because I want to be able to get a maximum life cycle out of an EVSC station. So ensuring that we're only recommending hardware for fleets that are what's called ISO 15118 compatible. What does that mean? That means that when a vehicle plugs into a station, that station can recognize the vehicle, which that's a technological advancement that Tesla broke through with only a few years ago. Now we're bringing that same technology to fleets to, one, improve the speed at which vehicles can be charged without having to swipe an RFID card or use a mobile app, it's a necessary evil in many cases. While at the same time being able to provide them with better data about what's going on with their fleet vehicles, mileage, different data points that are like housed in the computer program, in the computer terminal that's now being given to fleet managers to better manage their fleets, the same way telematics data started doing this about 15 or so years ago. So, we're trying to continually update while at the same time make as many recommendations as we can to help future proof and get as much longevity out of the equipment as possible.
Okay. Yeah. And I don't know. I would imagine at some point, just like iPhones, I mean, we get new iPhones occasionally, but they're not really, they're not changing a whole lot. It's pretty incremental change. So I got to think we might, would you think those life cycles will last longer at some point?
I do think at some point in the future we'll reach that kind of that equilibrium. It might not be your washer and dryer, and you might not get 15 or 20 years out of a station, but I do think we will get to a point where the technology, both inside the vehicle and then the equipment used to charge the vehicle, improves such that it increases the longevity. Therefore, it minimizes the investment, upfront investment, the capital expenses that figure into your TCO. So definitely something that I know fleet managers are looking forward to. On the battery technology side, which is aside from what we do at Blink, most batteries today use what's called liquid crystal, like batteries, almost like think of like a battery that you have in your house, and it's, battery acid, things like that. It's usually some type of a liquid that maintains the life cycle and longevity of that battery. And in which case, right now, the kind of the hot thing within the battery tech world is solid state batteries. So they operate at lower temperatures, they have much larger capacities. There isn't one yet in a commercial vehicle, but there's a number of companies that are working on that technology, and I'm sure they'll be selling it to some automotive manufacturer in the very near future. But those are things that are going to really reinvent the way that batteries accept charge, the rate at which they accept electricity. And so it should be a pretty big game changer. I think once we hit that stage of technical ability for the vehicles themselves, it'll create kind of like a settling within the EV marketplace where things aren't being replaced every 4 or 5 years.
Tell me, imagine a world where EVs are a lot more ubiquitous in commercial fleets. What does that world and industry look like to you?
Yeah, I think it's really the watershed moment in commercial fleets is when the batteries and charging technologies have reached an efficiency and a cost point where medium duty long range vehicles, thinks your box trucks and your and your daily drivers, right, are like the technology is such that there's no difference between fueling and deploying a vehicle of a class 3, 4, 5. And that's really where you're going to start to see a massive shift over to EV because of the fuel savings, right? Right now, the batteries and the infrastructure are too expensive to justify the fuel savings. And as those costs come down, the fuel savings is going to be what it is. And so I think you'll start to see a big shift in commercial fleets once we hit that point. Right now, the only fleets that can go majority electric are sedan and SUV fleets. You have some light duty truck fleets that are starting to do so as that availability of vehicles catches up and the cost comes down. And I actually just saw an article, I think today on LinkedIn, that said the expectation is that it will cost the same to manufacture an EV of like or similar construction as an ICE vehicle by around 2027. Now, if that's the case, we might see a larger shift sooner, but it all is kind of contingent on whether or not a battery can charge fast enough and has enough capacity for larger and medium duty vehicles, which are kind of the bread and butter of most fleets in America.
You mentioned Europe. Do you have an example of kind of how a country that's kind of ahead of us and kind of what it looks like today?
Yeah. So Blink operates networks and works with fleets primarily in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, and we're expanding there as well. It kind of comes down to the fact that the batteries that are used in those light duty vans, if you're in the UK, they'll call it a caravan or a what's the word that they use in the UK for? A lorry. Yeah, a lorry. So lorries in Europe, they have 200-300 mile range fully loaded capacity batteries. So that kind of changes the dynamic quite a bit. Whereas as of this moment, the only mass produced lorry size or small small delivery van size vehicle that has that type of range is the Rivian's van that was originally manufactured exclusively for Amazon. Now you have mock-ups that you're seeing in the marketplace. I think like AT&T and a few others have kind of like mock-ups of what their vans are going to look like when they get them. But the reality is that's the only van that's widely available or at least mass produced in North America that's capable of competing with the European vans. Ram, Stellantis, as well as Mercedes-Benz will have a vehicle here in the US by the end of next year, 2025, that's already being operated pretty substantially in Europe. So it's just a matter of availability of the technology so that the van can get from point A to point B with the people, goods, and services that it needs to sustain a business. And so that's really the only difference between us and Europe is kind of that level of commitment to rolling out that technology more quickly and in a more widespread fashion.
Jay, what's the best way for a fleet manager to start thinking about this topic and how to transition their fleet from ICE to EV?
Yeah, when it comes to deployment management and performance management of EV fleets, in my mind, there's 5 stages. And I've kind of touched on a couple of them, but I'll just kind of for the sake of understanding where a fleet manager is in their journey. There's the vision stage, the planning stage, the initial deployment, the scaling up, and the performance management. In the fleet, in a corporate fleet manager world, virtually all of them have well-oiled machines that are currently in this performance management stage year in and year out, from acquisition of vehicles to cost management to disposal of vehicles, and then the whole process starts over again. Let's introduce EVs and their required charging, right? Where's it coming from? What's going to be the plan? How fast are we going to do it? Those are kind of like your overall guardrails, your vision, right? And then it's like planning is let's get quotes, let's determine what's the best practice, let's fill our expertise gaps. And then it's like, okay, we got our initial installment. What are we going to do to make sure that this isn't just like one ribbon cutting and this can be replicated location after location? And ultimately, how are we going to get from that initial installment to being able to confidently scale, and then moving towards that stage where it's performance management the same way that it works for ICE vehicles today. So fleet managers are in my mind in one, and I would love to hear any other fleet managers out there in the world that kind of like are thinking of other stages that they might be in or things that they're experiencing. But in general, they're in one of those 5 stages. Key thing is get the right advice from the people that know the solutions. From the installation, are you working with installation partners that are experts in EV installation to ensure that it's going to be able to sustain your fleet for well into the future, versus an electrical contractor that's doing EVs on the side? Are you using the right equipment? Are you using the right charging solution for the duty cycle and the vehicle application? Are you future-proofing sites? If your site can support, I'm just going to use simple language, 100 vehicles today, and the goal is to make all 100 of those vehicles electric. Are you already having those conversations with your utility company? Are you talking about panel upgrades? Are you figuring out ways, and so that's like, yeah, after that initial installment, great. But like, how do we get from 1 to 100 on a site? And then we do that 50 times over. And so that's really where just filling that information gap and making sure that you have the right experts that you can rely on, number one. And right now, kind of just getting out there, asking questions, and talking to peers, because it's going to be the kind of the ability to kind of grow your understanding of these things. It's ultimately going to give you as a fleet manager the confidence to go to the rest of the organization and confidently say, I have a plan now for meeting your goals as a business. Because I have yet to meet too many fleet managers who they're the ones that are completely driving the EV adoption goals. It's usually somewhere, and there's some constituency within the business. Sometimes it's sustainability, sometimes it's the C-suite, sometimes it's consumer affairs. But ultimately, they're going to own it. If the vehicle doesn't get from point A to point B, regardless of whose idea it was before it went on the road, the fleet manager in the back of their mind is always going to be thinking, they're going to blame me for that happening. So what do I, as an expert in this industry, have to provide them with to make them feel confident about that decision to transition on a vehicle by vehicle basis?
We touched on TCO, or total cost of ownership, can be less, I think, for EVs. What are ways that this can manifest in EV fleets?
Yeah, great question. Number one is, and this is a little bit of a wild card, I will say. So the prevailing wisdom in the marketplace today is, because an EV doesn't have an engine and all of the moving parts that come with an engine, that the life cycle of an EV should be substantially longer than a gas-powered vehicle. Kind of the one indication that this might be the case is kind of the industry-leading warranties for powertrains or anything related to your engine or the systems that kind of make the wheels move. Those are typically about maximum 5 years. Most EV manufacturers today, their kind of first go at warranting what's called a propulsion system, not a powertrain, is at minimum about 8 years. So we've already started to see the manufacturers themselves kind of create signals in the marketplace that we're expecting these vehicles to go longer. If a vehicle goes longer, you can spread your depreciation out over a longer period of time, thereby lowering your single largest expense related to your TCO. Your second largest expense is gas on an ICE vehicle. You've just eliminated that expense line and replaced it with electricity. It's going to be dependent on what market you're in and what size vehicle there is. But in general, and I'll just use a super round number, most of the projections that we use very conservatively is that electricity costs about 60% less than gas does. And so even using that conservative number, you spread your depreciation, you reduce your fueling expense mile by mile by 60%. You're building a pretty compelling case for EVs, provided that you figured out a way to minimize or spread your expense when it comes to charging infrastructure requirements. And so those are the types of things where we're working really closely with our clients as well as our partners, because we have automotive manufacturing partners, we have dealership partners, we have commercial truck partners, in kind of keeping an eye on these trends and how it's ultimately impacting the fleet manager's perception of these expenses, and ultimately what's going to then, once they make that leap, how do we track those expenses to say, yeah, here's the model that we've built for you. How are we doing?
I'm a driver in a fleet, and I have to carry my expense card or my fuel card or all that stuff. Does that kind of help that kind of whole workflow, or is that?
It sure does. Yeah, I can tell you, Todd. Our vision here at Blink is to create frictionless fleet EV deployments, where there's a plan for infrastructure, whether that's on your property, at a person's home, or in the wild. There's a plan for how that person charges, either on a vehicle, their vehicle, either at a Blink station, a home station, depot station, to where they plug in, it authenticates, it gives the fleet manager all the data that they need to know that battery life, battery health, all the things that like are different about running an EV fleet can come through just that simple plug, that simple connection, And that's really going to be one of those, as we continue to build out that product set with, I mentioned earlier about choosing equipment. Like, we here at Blink only advocate for equipment that is going for fleet applications that is 4G wireless or greater enabled versus wireless. Why? Because there's a lot of privacy concerns that are raised. Like, if you're going to tell an employee you're going to install an EV charging station in their home for business use because they park a fleet vehicle in their garage every night, one of the first questions they say is, why do you need my Wi-Fi password? What does that have to do? So it's choosing equipment that doesn't need that type of connection to minimize privacy concerns. There's another reimbursement issue that you may or may not have avoided. So those are just the types of things where, like, Blink's going to make some of those decisions for fleet managers beforehand, so that when they go to deploy these assets at different locations, we're minimizing the amount of friction that's created every time that a vehicle goes into service.
Okay. Well, Jay, we're nearing the end of our conversation. I like to close them by refocusing on the why of what we do. So what motivates you to do this work day in and day out? What keeps you excited and passionate about what you do?
Yeah, I've been in fleet and mobility solutions virtually my entire career. Specifically focused on the EV transition for the last 3, almost 4 years. Something about creating a marketplace where it doesn't exist today, and that marketplace being more efficient than the one that it's replacing when it reaches its critical mass, is really, really exciting to me. So the general opinion in the marketplace today is that the EV adoption within commercial fleet and government fleet applications, it's too early. And there are very clear examples of that not being the case. And I really love being able to take that information and confidently present it to operators, who then are able to confidently present it to business leaders, who are then confidently able to present it to investors and consumers. and it's, in a way, we're doing something that's like building a rocket and going to the moon, one vehicle at a time. So that's what I really love about working at Blink and more broadly within the EV charging hardware and vehicle space.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, I mean, you've taught me a lot about kind of just EV in general and EV in fleets, which, again, something I hadn't really thought a whole lot about. So I really appreciate that. It's been great having you on the show, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate y'all.
That was my conversation with Jay Hudson, Fleet Sales Director for Blink Charging. You can connect with Jay and what he's working on by heading to the links in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, you can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast player. Thanks for listening to this episode of Keeping the Lights On. We'll see you next time.